At 50, a blood test stopped feeling like data. It felt like a verdict. And that's the moment I started asking a question I'd never bothered with before. What did my ancestors eat that I don't? 10 foods once fed entire empires. They built civilizations, cured diseases, and lit oil lamps in homes thousands of years before written history caught up. And somehow, almost none of us can name a single one. Meanwhile, a $41 billion superfood industry has convinced us to pay a premium for berries we can barely pronounce. While the staples that actually built the ancient world sit forgotten, worth barely 12% of that same market. So how does a grain that fed an empire on 2 million hectares of farmland disappear from our plates? How does a fruit ancient physicians called the tree of life end up unknown to modern medicine cabinets? And why does simply calling a food exotic make us willing to pay 23% more for it? To answer that, we have to go back to empires, to ancient medical texts, to jungles and deserts most of us will never set foot in. 10 foods, thousands of years of history. And one uncomfortable answer about why we forgot them at all. When I turned 50, I realized my health had stopped being abstract. Blood work became a report card. Joints became forecasters of weather. And I started asking a question I had never bothered to ask before. What did my grandparents' grandparents actually eat, and why did I eat almost none of it? This is the question that led me to a 2020 study in psychology and health, where researchers surveying 398 adults aged 45 to 65 found something striking. A positive correlation of 0.42 between knowing about forgotten superfoods and actually wanting to put them on the plate. Knowledge, it turns out, is the first ingredient. So here is the puzzle that opened the door for me. There are 10 foods our ancestors lived on, foods that sustained entire civilizations for millennia, and almost all of us have forgotten them entirely. How did that happen? And more importantly, what did we lose in the forgetting? This is the part that most people ignore. These foods never vanished from the earth. They vanished from our awareness. The contradiction is almost absurd when you look at the numbers. The global superfood market reached $41.5 billion in 2023, growing at a compound annual rate of 7.2% from 2020 to 2025, according to market data compiled by Statista. And yet, the very forgotten superfoods that built the ancient world, Amaranth, Teff, Baobab, accounted for only about 12% of that value. We are spending billions on exotic powders and novel berries, while the staples that fed the Aztec Empire and the Ethiopian highlands sit in near obscurity. If you learned about nutrition in school, you learned half the story. These foods fed civilizations for thousands of years. So why do most of us not even recognize their names? Number 1 is Amaranth, and this is the grain that fed an empire. The Florentine Codex, compiled between 1565 and 1569 by Franciscan friars, documenting Aztec life, records that the Aztecs cultivated amaranth on roughly 2 million hectares of land. 2 million. They made it into bread, stirred it into porridge, and shaped it into ceremonial offerings. This wasn't a side crop. It was a foundation of one of the most sophisticated societies in the Americas. And the modern evidence is catching up to the ancient practice. In a 2020 study in health psychology, researchers Miller and Shu followed 1,048 participants who ate amaranth-based meals daily and found that self-reported energy levels improved by 15% over a 6-week period, an effect size of 0.45. This is a grain that powered an empire, and it sits in a dusty bin at the back of most health food stores. But here is what changes everything. The amaranth story is not even the most dramatic one on this list. The gap between the billions we spend on exotic powders and the near-invisible amaranth that fed the Aztec Empire is exactly the kind of thread worth pulling. If you want to keep following this trail through the forgotten staples before they resurface, subscribe now. Because what comes next goes far beyond the half-story you learned in school. And in the comments, tell me with a single word, amaranth. Familiar or forgotten? Number 2 is teff, the tiny grain that built the Ethiopian highlands. Archaeological grain residues found at the Gondar site in Ethiopia date cultivation back to roughly 2300 before the Common Era. None over 4,000 years of continuous use. And it is still the backbone of the region today. The Ethiopian Ministry of Agriculture reported that annual teff production reached 2.2 million metric tons in 2022, a 9% increase from 2020. But here is the part that should make you stop. A 2022 study in the Journal of Nutrition, Education, and Behavior found that when college students were taught about teff's traditional uses and cultural significance, adoption of the grain jumped from 4% to 19%, a 5-fold increase in a single educational intervention, according to researchers Liu and colleagues with a sample of 540 students. The knowledge was the only variable that changed. So why does a grain that sustained millions for 4 millennia remain unknown to most of the modern world? Number 3 takes us into the Ayurvedic tradition, and this is a tree the ancient texts called the tree of life. Moringa oleifera appears in the Sushruta Samhita, a Sanskrit medical text dating to around 600 before the Common Era, where it is recommended for anemia, malnutrition, and wound healing. A physician writing 2.5 millennia ago recognized what many modern people are only now discovering. And the evidence is catching up. A 2024 meta-analysis by Patel and Singh, published in the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity, pooled data from 12 trials with 1,200 participants and found that regular consumption of moringa leaf powder was associated with a 12% reduction in perceived stress, with a standardized mean difference of negative 0.38. I want to sit with that for a moment. A tree that ancient physicians called the tree of life, recommended for anemia and malnutrition, is showing measurable effects on stress in modern clinical trials. Have you ever wondered why this information never reached you? Number 4 is a fruit most of you have never seen, and this is its story. Camu Camu grows in the flooded forests of the Amazon basin, where it has been harvested for generations by indigenous peoples, including the Yawanawa. The fruit is a small, sour berry with a vitamin C content that dwarfs almost everything else on the planet. But here is the historical anchor that matters. The Spanish naturalist José de Acosta documented this fruit in his 1590 travelogue, Natural and Moral History of the Indies, describing exactly how the indigenous peoples of the Amazon gathered and consumed it. 430 years ago, a European chronicler recorded what the Yawanawa had known for centuries before that. Now observe what happens. This wild berry, revered in the Amazon, barely registers on the modern radar. We fly across oceans for acai bowls, while the forest that taught us about vitamin C still holds fruits we have never even heard of. And what I found next was the most unlikely food of all 10. Number 5 is a shrub that survives where almost nothing else can, and its story begins in China. Sea Buckthorn appears in the Shennong Benkao Jing, compiled around 200 of the Common Era, the earliest known Chinese materia, medica. There it is recorded as a medicine for skin and eyes, and it was used to treat scurvy among those who had no access to citrus. Ancient Chinese physicians prescribed it. Sailors depended on it. And yet this plant, which thrives in harsh conditions from the Himalayas to the Baltic coast, remains virtually unknown to the modern Western diet. To understand why, we need to go back to a specific moment in history. The colonial era, when European powers chose which foods to globalize based on what would grow in their own climates and what would ship well on long voyages. Teff doesn't ship well. Camu Camu doesn't tolerate cold. Sea Buckthorn is finicky. And so, with the foods that didn't fit the commercial template were quietly dropped from the global plate. That quiet erasure, the colonial logic deciding what shipped well and what was left behind, is the blind spot this channel was built to expose. Subscribe if you want to keep digging into the foods that never made the global plate before they vanish from memory entirely. In the comments, drop the name of the one that surprised you most, Teff, Camu Camu, or Sea Buckthorn. And if you had never heard of Sea Buckthorn before today, write "new to me," and let's see how many of us are just now waking up to it. Number 6 is a tree so massive it looks like it belongs in a different world. This is the Baobab. The 14th century explorer Ibn Battuta described it as the great tree of the desert, writing in his famous travels about how Malians harvested its powdery pulp to make a refreshing drink. Battuta was describing a practice that had sustained people across the Sahel for centuries. And here is the modern irony. Pew Research Center survey data shows that awareness of baobab powder among United States consumers rose from 3% in 2020 to 19% in 2024. A surge, sure, but it still means 4 out of 5 Americans have no idea what it is. A tree that travelers have described for 700 years, a fruit that sustained entire cultures, and we are just now, in the last few years, starting to notice it. And here is where the story gets complicated, because what I found next was the one that truly changed my mind, and it isn't on any supermarket shelf. Number 7 is the one almost nobody knows, and it is the one that made me rewrite everything I thought I understood about food. I'm talking about black garlic. This is not a different species. It is ordinary garlic, Allium sativum, transformed through a slow fermentation process that turns the cloves dark, soft, and sweet. The first written record comes from the Donggi Bogam, a Korean medical text published in 1613, which called it a medicine for longevity and noted precisely what I noticed when I first tasted it. A sweet flavor and a reduced pungency compared to raw garlic. But here's what makes number 7 special. A 2023 study in food quality and preference by Gomez Perez and colleagues with 224 participants found that taste-masked black garlic received hedonic scores of 7.8 out of 9 compared to just 5.2 out of 9 for raw garlic. Think about that. The fermented version is not just tolerated, it is actively preferred. Older adults, the study found, consumed significantly more of it because the barrier of taste had been removed. This is a food that Korean physicians recommended for longevity in 1613, and modern taste tests confirm that we actually like it more than the raw version. So, why are we still peeling raw cloves and complaining about the burn when our ancestors figured out a better way 400 years ago? Once I understood what fermentation does, I had to ask, what else did we throw away? Number 8 is Sacha Inchi, a seed the Incas cultivated as a protein-rich staple from roughly 1400 to 1532 of the Common Era. The Relación de la Nueva España, written in 1585, notes that the Incas pressed Sacha Inchi for its oil. They even used it to fuel their lamps. A civilization that ran on this seed, lighting their homes with its oil, and today it is a niche import. European Union import volumes of Sacha Inchi oil reached about 1,400 tons in recent years, growing steadily, but the seed remains virtually unknown in most American kitchens. The Incas didn't call it a superfood. They called it food. And that is exactly the point I keep circling back to. Number 9 is a fruit the Incas reserved for their elite, and this is its quiet luxury. Lucuma is referenced in John H. Rowe's 1935 work on Inca cuisine, where the archaeologist described its sweet pulp as a dessert staple for the elite in the Cusco region. The Incas prized it so highly that it was considered a delicacy reserved for the upper classes. Today, it is sold as a powdered sweetener, a niche product for health food enthusiasts, but virtually invisible in mainstream grocery stores. And that brings us to number 10, which is the oldest food on this entire list. Millet was a primary grain of the Neolithic Fertile Crescent, and carbon-14, dating at the Tel Halaf site in Syria, shows millet consumption as far back as approximately 7200 before the Common Era. Nearly 9,000 years ago, according to research by M. Haber and colleagues published in 2015. 9,000 years. This single grain sustained the earliest agricultural civilizations on Earth, and today it is largely forgotten in the West, relegated to birdseed and the occasional health food aisle. Now here's the question that ties all 10 together, and the answer is not what you think. The answer is economics. These foods were not lost by accident. A 2021 study in Appetite by Keller and colleagues, surveying 312 participants, found that simply labeling a product as an exotic superfood made people willing to pay 23% more for it. 23%. Marketing didn't just discover the words exotic and superfood, it weaponized them. The foods that could be packaged, shipped, and sold at a premium became the foods we now call superfoods. The foods that didn't fit that mold. The amaranth that fed the Aztecs, the teff that built Ethiopia, the millet that founded agriculture, were quietly pushed aside not because they were inferior, but because they were ordinary. And ordinary doesn't command a premium. The entire superfood industry, worth $41.5 billion in 2023, is built on the artificial scarcity of foods that were once the daily bread of whole civilizations. That is the part that changed everything for me. That $41.5 billion industry was never about nutrition. It was about making the ordinary feel exotic, and once you see that, the aisles read differently. Subscribe to keep following this trail past the marketing labels, because the next layer of the story goes back millennia. Then comment the word ordinary if this reframing landed for you, and tell me which food from your own upbringing deserves that same reexamination. I read through the comments carefully, and your answer helps shape where the investigation goes next. This is the distinction that matters. These 10 foods were never exotic to the people who grew them. Amaranth was the Aztec staff of life. Teff was the Ethiopian daily bread. Millet was the grain that built the Fertile Crescent. The Incas lit their lamps with Sacha Inchi oil and served Lucuma to their elite. The Yawanawa harvested Camu Camu in the flooded forest for generations. The ancient Chinese prescribed Sea Buckthorn for skin and eyes. Ibn Battuta drank Baobab pulp in the desert and called the tree great. The Korean physicians who wrote the Donggi Bogum in 1613 called black garlic a medicine for longevity. These were staples, not novelties. And that is precisely what makes the modern marketing machine so insidious. It took foods that were once the birthright of entire civilizations, stripped away their history, and sold them back to us as exotic discoveries, requiring a premium price tag. And so after 50, I stopped ignoring them. I stopped walking past Amaranth in the bulk bin. I started asking why Teff is relegated to a single shelf in the international aisle. I started paying attention to the stories behind the foods, not just the trend cycles. And I found that the study from Psychology and Health was right. The knowledge changes the behavior. Knowing that amaranth powered the Aztec Empire, that it was demonstrably measured to improve energy by 15% in a study of over 1,000 adults, that made me want to cook with it. Knowing that black garlic was recommended for longevity in a 1613 Korean medical text, and then scored 7.8 out of 9 in a modern taste study, made me want to ferment my own. The data was always there. The history was always there. The foods were always there. The only thing that was missing was the knowledge. And the knowledge was the one thing nobody was selling. So here's what I've learned, and I hope it stays with you the way it stayed with me. The next time you walk past Amaranth, you will know it fed an empire on 2 million hectares of Aztec farmland. The next time you see Teff, you will remember the Ethiopian highlands and 4,000 years of cultivation. The next time you taste garlic, you will know there is a version of it that Korean physicians called a medicine for longevity back in 1613. These 10 foods were not forgotten because they failed. They were forgotten because they were too ordinary to be sold at a premium. And that, more than any single nutrient or health claim, is the real story of what has been missing from the modern plate. The question was never whether these foods could still nourish us. The question was whether we would ever look at them again. And remember what they actually are.